The idea behind doing a tape on lighting backgrounds is to look at background lighting as a separate element. I think too often we're lighting our subject areas and just kind of haphazardly letting spill light end up on the background from our key lights, from our fill lights, and the background just ends up illuminated by all of this spill light, and that's not what makes a great image. So the idea here is to look at a lot of different images and find out what made that image work. And often I think a lot of it has to do with light control of your main subject area. I put a lot of effort into controlling all of my spill light to keep that background area a separate element and keep it clear of any spill light. And then once it is clear of spill light, then I can use colored gels and patterns and all kinds of different techniques to give a sense of time of day or mood or drama or whatever I think is appropriate for the image. So hopefully by looking at all of these different images, we can start to give some new ways of thinking and some new techniques for lighting backgrounds.
There are many times in film and video production when elements in the background are difficult to control. Background elements such as lighted rooms, bright windows, and backlit signs might be thought of as a constant in your shots, and therefore they should be carefully considered when determining your working exposure and lighting plan. Bill Holshevnikoff explains.
The concept behind defining a constant is a very simple idea, but I think a very important one. If you have, say, a lighted sign or a newsroom or a brightly lit window behind your subject, then that's an area in your background that you need to consider in your exposure. And it's also going to affect your lighting plan. So let's say there's a newsroom behind me. I first set my exposure so the newsroom looks good. I check my f-stop, lock it off, and say it's f4. Then I light all of the talent in the news set in the foreground to match that exposure at f4, and then I'm done. And my background looks great and my foreground looks great, as opposed to just some arbitrary light value that I first light my subjects with and then look at the background and go, well, gee, it's too bright now, or it's too dark, and then trying to figure out the problem. So if you can attack it first by defining that constant, the area that you can't change the brightness of, define it, lock it in, get your exposure for it, and then light your subject to match that exposure, you're going to save a lot of time and effort and get a lot better looking images.
In this first image, Holshevnikoff used both lighting and filtration to create a natural-looking scene. The defining element, or constant, in the shot was the bright, sunny exterior scene behind the couple in the spa. To determine how to best light this shot, Holshevnikoff first set the camera for a proper exposure of the background. A two-stop neutral density graduated filter also is used to control the brightness of the sky and the lake. With the camera set at f11 for a proper background exposure, two Arri 1200-watt HMI par lights were then used to light the foreground area. The first light was placed outside the patio area and was used to simulate sunlight on the subjects. The second instrument was placed at ground level near the edge of the spa. With a single sheet of GAM 1075 diffusion on the front of the barn doors, this instrument was set close to the subjects to produce a light level that would match the brightness of the background exposure. The addition of the two-stop ND grad filter reduced the brightness of the background at the top of the frame to complete the image. A look at the diagram of the lighting shows the placement of the light sources relative to the subjects and the camera. In another example of lighting for a background element, this image of a hotel sleeping room reveals natural-looking interior lighting. But the lighting plan for this shot was determined by the brightness of the daylight exterior. With the interior lighting turned off, we can see the properly exposed window area and just how little ambient room light there really is relative to the brightness of the sun. By opening the camera iris, a better ambient light exposure can be achieved, but the window, the constant in this shot, is then overexposed. By first determining the proper exposure of your background element, you can then light the interior space at the proper light level to create a natural-looking, well-exposed image. The diagram shows where two Arri 1200-watt par lights were hidden from the camera to create the shaft of light and the bounce fill lighting for the room. Another situation that is common to lighting interviews on location is the window background. For this shot, Holshevnikoff first set his exposure to get the look that he wanted with the warm, late afternoon light coming through the blinds. And he then lit the subject with tungsten lights to match the exposure of the windows. A look at the diagram for this image shows the use of a 1000 watt Lowell Totalight inside a medium Camera light bank. The light bank is the main light source and is set very close to the subject to match the exposure of the window area. A small white card was used as a bounce fill source, and an ARRI 300 watt Fresnel light was used to light the plant behind the subject. Another look at the final image shows how simplistic the lighting plan can be once you have first set your exposure for the constant in the background. This lighting evolution of an interior restaurant scene shows yet another example of how lighting for an established background exposure can help you to quickly produce accurate results when working with difficult backgrounds. Finding the constant in a studio setting can be just as important as when working on location. This image of a news set in Bucharest, Romania, was illuminated almost entirely with KinoFlow fluorescent fixtures. But before a single fixture was turned on, the camera exposure was first determined by the brightness of the background elements, and the subjects were then lit to match the camera exposure. The graphic in the background was backlit by warm white fluorescent tubes, and the daylight color-balanced monitors were covered with 1/2 CTO correction gel. This fluorescent-lit news set in San Francisco has a working newsroom behind the set. The station wanted to see the busy newsroom in the background, but did not want the background elements to conflict with the foreground talent. By using the newsroom as a constant and intentionally underexposing the background first, the foreground subjects were then lighted to become the focus of the image. In addition, a dark blue shark's tooth net was stretched on frames and placed behind the talent. A 2000 watt Fresnel lensed light with a single sheet of GAM 1/2 CTB correction gel was used to illuminate the bottom half of the netting. This lighting effect added color to the shot. It also further obscured the movement in the newsroom from the camera. Once you have determined if there is a background element to consider in your lighting plan, you must then decide which lighting instruments are best for the job. Light control is one of the most important aspects of lighting. Choosing the proper instrument and controlling the spill light from your backgrounds can add impact and production value to your images.